Welcome back, everybody.
Mm.
I think we can all relate to that feeling of being totally overwhelmed by choices. Like, the other day I was trying to pick out a new coffee maker, and I swear there were like a million options. Seriously, I was reading reviews, comparing features, just totally lost in a sea of coffee makers.
It's true. The modern world really does bombard us with choices, doesn't it? And sometimes that abundance of options, well, it doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. Let's just say that.
Right. I mean, I thought having more choices would make it easier to find the perfect coffee maker,
Yeah.
you know. But I ended up more confused than when I started. Like, not too much of a good thing.
Exactly. And that actually ties into a fascinating psychological phenomenon called the paradox of choice.
Okay. Paradox of choice. I'm listening.
So think about it this way. Have you ever been at the grocery store standing in front of a giant display of jams?
Yeah, I think we've all been there.
Right. Now, you'd think that having tons of different jams to choose from would make it easier to find one you love. But studies have actually shown that when people are faced with too many options, they're actually less likely to buy anything. And even if they do buy something, they're often less satisfied with their choice.
Wait a minute. So you're telling me that having more choices can actually make us less happy? That seems kind of backwards, doesn't it?
That's the paradox. Psychologist Barry Schwartz, who actually coined the term, argues that too much choice can lead to decision fatigue regret and even a sense of responsibility for making the wrong choice.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. It's like that feeling of being totally frozen when you're staring at a menu with like 100 different dishes. It's just too much to process. But is there like actual scientific evidence to back this up?
Absolutely. That jam study I mentioned, that's a classic example. Researchers found that shoppers were 10 times more likely to buy jam when they were presented with only 6 varieties compared to 24.
10 times. Wow. Okay, that's pretty convincing. But I have to imagine this isn't a hard and fast rule, Ryan. Like, there must be times when having more choices is a good thing.
You're right, it's not always black and white. The impact of choice really depends on a whole bunch of different factors. Like, if you already have a really specific need in mind or a deep understanding of your preferences, then having more options could be really helpful.
So it's not just a simple case of more choices bad, fewer choices good. It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And in fact, some of the research we looked at actually pushed back on the idea that choice overload is always a negative thing.
Interesting. So what's the deal then? Is choice overload a myth?
Well, not exactly. A 2010 meta-analysis actually found that the negative effects of choice overload were often really small or even non-existent in some cases. And sometimes having more choices did actually lead to better outcomes.
Okay, so if the research is mixed, how do we know when having more options is going to be helpful and when it's going to send us spiraling into a choice overload meltdown?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. One of the key factors is how complex those choices actually are. Choosing between different types of bread, that's probably not going to overwhelm most people. But trying to compare like dozens of health insurance plans with all those different coverage levels and premiums, now that's a whole different story.
Right, that makes total sense. So complexity is a big factor. What else do we need to consider?
Another important factor is how difficult the decision-making task itself is. If there's like a clear best option, one that really stands out from the rest, then having more choices might not be such a big deal. But if all the options seem pretty similar and you have to weigh a ton of different factors, well, it can get overwhelming really fast.
Okay, so we've got the complexity of the choices and the difficulty of the task. Anything else?
Well, one of the sources we looked at pointed out that even if you do have a lot of choices, the way those choices are presented can make a huge difference.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
Think about those restaurants that let you customize your burger, where you can pick from like a million different
Oh
toppings.
yeah, those places are dangerous.
Right. Even though there might be thousands of potential burger combinations, if the restaurant breaks down the choices into a clear step-by-step process, with different categories and filters, it can actually make it a lot more manageable for the customer.
So it's not just about the number of choices, but how those choices are organized and presented to us.
You got it. It's about finding that sweet spot between offering enough options to meet people's needs and preferences, but also giving them the structure and guidance they need to actually navigate those choices effectively.
Makes sense. But I'm also thinking about the psychological side of things. Like, doesn't having more choices also come with this added sense of responsibility?
Yeah.
If you have tons of options and you make the wrong choice, it feels like it's totally your fault, right?
Yep. That's a great point. And one of the sources actually highlighted that very issue. It argued that when we only have a limited number of choices, we tend to view the decision maker, like let's say an employer who's offering retirement plans, as more responsible for the quality of those options. But when we have a wide range of choices, that sense of responsibility shifts over to the individual.
So if my employer gives me like 50 different retirement plans to choose from, and I pick one that totally tanks, it's suddenly my fault, even though they were the ones who gave me that massive list of options in the first place.
Exactly. It's a really interesting dynamic, and it raises all sorts of ethical and social questions, especially when we're talking about things like healthcare or retirement planning where the stakes are so high.
Definitely food for thought.
Hmm.
So this whole paradox of choice thing, it's a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface. There's a lot to consider in terms of how our brains process choices, how those choices are presented, and even the ethical implications of having too much or too little choice.
I agree. And understanding all these nuances can really help us make more informed decisions that ultimately lead to greater satisfaction.
Well, all this choice talk has definitely got me thinking. But hey, maybe we can unpack some strategies for dealing with choice overload in our next segment. What do you think?
Sounds like a plan. We'll be right back after a quick break.
All right, so we're back, and we've been talking about this whole paradox of choice thing. It's a lot to wrap your head around. So let's get practical. Like, how do we actually deal with this in our everyday lives? What are some strategies we can use to avoid feeling overwhelmed by all the choices we have to make?
Well, one really effective strategy is something that Barry Schwartz calls satisficing.
Satisficing. Okay, I've never heard of that before. What is that?
Basically, it means, aiming for good enough instead of trying to find the absolute best possible option. Because when we try to optimize every single decision we make, we often end up feeling disappointed. Because in reality, it's almost impossible to be 100% certain that we've considered every single option out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know I'm totally guilty of that. Like, I'll spend hours researching something, trying to find the perfect thing, and then I end up feeling even more stressed out than when I started. But isn't there a danger in settling for good enough? Like, don't we want to strive for the best in everything we do?
That's a great question. And yeah, of course, there are times when it's really important to carefully weigh your options and make the most informed decision you can. But when it comes to those everyday choices, like picking a movie to watch or deciding what to have for dinner, striving for perfection can lead to analysis paralysis. And that can actually make us less happy in the long run.
Right, so it's about picking your battles. Like, some decisions are worth really putting in the time and effort, but for those smaller, less important choices, it's okay to just go with something that's good enough.
Hmm.
So how do we know when to satisfice and when to really go all out and do all the research and comparison?
It's definitely a judgment call. But a good rule of thumb is to consider the stakes of the decision. If it's a relatively low stakes choice, like what kind of cereal to buy or which route to take to work, go with your gut. Or use a simple decision rule to narrow down your options. But if it's a high stakes decision, something like buying a house or choosing a career path, then yeah, it's probably worth investing more time and energy in the process.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got satisficing for those everyday choices. Any other strategies we can use to, like, keep the choice monster at bay?
Another really powerful strategy is to create routines and decision rules for those everyday choices. That can free up a lot of mental energy for those bigger, more important decisions.
Oh, I like that. It's like putting those little decisions on autopilot so you don't even have to think about them anymore.
Exactly. Think about Steve Jobs. He always wore that black turtleneck. He supposedly did that to simplify his choices and, reduce decision fatigue.
I actually tried that once, wearing the same outfit every day for a week. My laundry basket was not happy about it. But I get the point. It's about getting rid of those unnecessary decisions from your day.
Yeah. And you can apply that to all sorts of things, like what you eat for breakfast, your workout routine, even how you structure your workday.
So instead of spending 20 minutes every morning trying to decide what to eat for breakfast, I could just pick a few go-to options and rotate through them.
Yep, exactly. By establishing a routine, you eliminate that decision fatigue and free up mental bandwidth for other things.
I'm already feeling less stressed just thinking about it. So we've got satisficing, we've got routines. Any other tips for dealing with choice overload?
Well, when you are faced with a more complex decision, one that requires some serious thought, it can be really helpful to break down that decision into smaller, more manageable steps. We talked about this earlier with the customizable burger example.
Right, instead of trying to choose every single topping at once, you just focus on one thing at a time. Protein, then cheese, then toppings.
Exactly. And that approach can be applied to Well, pretty much any decision, from buying a car to planning a vacation. By breaking it down into smaller chunks, it feels less overwhelming, and you're less likely to get stuck.
It's like that old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Huh, exactly. And remember, it's okay to set limits. You don't have to consider every single option out there.
So if I'm looking for a new phone, I don't need to read reviews for every single phone on the market.
Nope. Just start by figuring out what features are really important to you and what your budget is. Then focus your research on phones that actually fit those criteria. You can also narrow down your choices by reading reviews from sources you trust or, just asking friends for recommendations.
Okay, so it's not about eliminating choice completely. It's about being more strategic in how we approach it.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the big takeaways here. Choice in itself isn't the problem. It's that feeling of being overwhelmed and controlled by choice that leads to dissatisfaction.
So it's about taking back control of our decision-making and finding a balance that works for us as individuals.
Absolutely. And, this brings up an even bigger question. Does having all these choices actually make us happier as a society? I mean, think about it. Our grandparents didn't have nearly as many choices as we do today, did they?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, part of me kind of envies the simplicity of life back then. Fewer decisions to make, less to stress about. But then again, I do love having the freedom to choose, like what I eat, what I do for work. It's a tough one.
It really is. It's like a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, having options gives us the power to customize our lives, to follow our passions, to express our individuality, and that's amazing. But on the other hand, constantly being bombarded with choices can be exhausting. It can lead to decision fatigue, anxiety, and this feeling that we're never quite doing enough or choosing the right things.
Yeah, it's like we're living in this perpetual state of FOMO, fear of missing out. We're so busy comparing ourselves to everyone else and second-guessing every little decision that we forget to just enjoy the moment.
Exactly. And all that pressure to optimize every aspect of our lives, well, it takes a toll. It's no wonder that rates of anxiety and depression are going up, especially in today's world where we're constantly connected and bombarded with information.
So what's the solution? Do we all need to, ditch our smartphones and go live in a cabin in the woods to escape this paradox of choice?
Well, I don't think it has to be that extreme. It's really about finding a balance, recognizing that while choice can be empowering, it can also be a source of stress if we let it. The key is to be more mindful about the choices we make and to use those strategies we talked about to manage that feeling of overload.
So it's not about getting rid of choice completely. It's about making more conscious choices and, being okay with good enough sometimes.
You got it. And honestly, I think that's a really important message, especially in today's world where we're constantly told to strive for perfection and have it all. It's okay to let go of that pressure a little bit and just focus on what truly matters to us.
I love that. Letting go of the pressure to be perfect and embracing the freedom to choose what works for us as individuals. That's something I think we can all get behind.
Totally agree. And at the end of the day, the goal isn't to eliminate choice. It's to make choice work for us, not against us.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about how to approach decision-making in a more mindful way.
I'm glad to hear it. And for anyone listening who wants to explore this topic even further, I highly recommend checking out Barry Schwartz's book, The Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less. It's a really fascinating read that really dives deep into how our choices shape our lives.
That's a great suggestion. And on that note, we're wrapping up for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the paradox of choice. Until next time, remember to be kind to yourselves, make conscious choices, and embrace the power of good enough.
It really is. It's like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, having all these options lets us really customize our lives. We can pursue our passions, express our individuality, and that can be incredibly empowering. But then on the other hand, being constantly bombarded with choices, it can be totally draining. It leads to decision fatigue, anxiety, and that nagging sense that we're never quite doing enough or that we're not choosing the right things.
It's true. I mean, it's like we're living in this constant state of FOMO, fear of missing out. And we're so busy comparing ourselves to others, second-guessing our decisions, that we forget to actually enjoy what we have.
Right, and all that pressure to optimize every single aspect of our lives, I mean, that takes a real toll. I think that's part of the reason why we see these rising rates of anxiety and depression, especially with everyone being so connected and bombarded with information all the time.
So is there a solution? I mean, do we need to, get rid of our smartphones and retreat to a cabin in the woods to escape this paradox of choice?
Well, I don't think it needs to be that drastic. It's more about finding that balance, recognizing that choice can be empowering, but it can also be a source of stress if we let it. The key, I think, is to be more mindful about the choices we're making and to use some of those strategies we talked about to manage that feeling of overload.
So it's not about like eliminating choice altogether. It's about being more intentional with the choices we make and being okay with good enough sometimes.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important message, especially nowadays, in a culture that's always pushing us to strive for perfection and to have it all. It's okay to let go of some of that pressure. Just focus on what really matters.
I like that. Letting go of the need to be perfect and embracing the freedom to choose what works for us. That's something I think we all could use a little more of.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, the goal isn't to eliminate choice, but to make it work for us, not against us.
I really enjoyed this conversation. It's definitely given me a new perspective on how to approach decision making in my own life.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And for anyone listening who wants to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend checking out Barry Schwartz's book. It's called The Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less. It's a really fascinating look at how the choices we make really do shape our lives.
That's a great recommendation. And on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of the paradox of choice. And until next time, remember, be kind to yourselves, be mindful of the choices you make, and embrace the power of good enough.